thank you all for coming, and I welcome you. And it's my privilege and honor to welcome a good friend, Padraig Otuma, to the College of Southern Maryland. One day, hopefully, it'll be face to face, but for the moment, this is what we got. Rachel and I are going to do two separate intros, but it won't take too long. I could spend an hour going over Padraig's accolades, his awards, and his accomplishments, but I'm not going to do that. His work speaks for itself. I'd rather say something about Padraig's generosity of spirit, his dedication to giving the gift of storytelling, of peace and reconciliation, of sharing our common, irreplaceable, and essential humanity, our hopes and fears, our joys and sorrows, even if, or especially if, we have moments of doubt that we're alone and isolated in this life. Padraig's work brings us closer to a fundamental truth, that we exist in moments of doubt, isolation, and at times deep and dark confusion. But we also exist in moments of joy and love, of hares, lo deer, thank you, in Irish, and of dogs running along the beach, of taking walks with dear friends, of loved ones here and gone away, and of loved ones still to come. And for that, we are sincerely grateful. Thank you, Padraig. You're muted, Rachel.
Sorry. I'll start again. Now, I won't take too long, but I have been working with my students, and it's been a joy bringing your voice and your work into the classroom. So I just wanted to say something of how I feel about what that's brought. And I haven't known you too long, but I do want to congratulate you on some amazing successes. Poetry Unbound has certainly become a favorite for me, and I know it's the same for many people across the globe, and your residency at Columbia. And I have to imagine you may keep pinching yourself, but you shouldn't, and not to flatter, because you are you. And I say this because in so many of your programs in poetry, it is that you are always encouraging the love of self. How liberating and warm it is when we see ourselves, as you say in your poem, How to Be Alone, as such interesting conversation, believing it is perfectly beautiful to be a community of madness. Muriel Rukeyser said to accept the invitation poetry sends, respond to it, and learn to feel. You, Padraig, I think, must send that invitation more than 10 times a day, holding open so many doors for people, saying, please come in, let's have a cup of tea or coffee. I think it is that you know how healing this is, how being vulnerable is nothing negative and quite the opposite. And you invite conversation too, another gesture of please come in, I want to hear your stories. This job you've taken on, Padraig, is purely human kindness, genuine, brave, witty. And I am sure it is not always easy, even with that Irish accent bathed in morning sun, to convince people of their worth. You have a special place in this world. So thank you. I know everyone listening will agree with Neil and me. No, it's not flattery, it's the truth. So we were thinking that maybe after those two introductions, you could start us off with a poem.
Thanks very much, Rachel and Neil. It's lovely to be with you. And I had a quick read through all the participants' names. It's nice to see your names, and I really do hope that we get a chance to interact. I'm looking forward to that. Let me read a few poems. I had a difficult childhood, and I like science fiction, and in some science fiction pieces of work, you see that there's parallel universes. And I was thinking one day about what if there was a parallel universe where another Padraig was able to open a little window and say something to the younger me to help me get through. And Then I thought, well, maybe he did. And maybe he just was only able to say one thing. And what he said was poetry. And I feel like that's been something that's held my life together through difficult times. And some of the poems I turned to and I learned off by heart, or some of the poems that I wrote during especially difficult years, are ones that I turn back to as a certain kind of comfort. And I'm so glad to have been that whoever it was, another Padraig from another universe, shouted out the word poetry to me. So here's a short poem called The One Thing. There must have been some other me who lived some other time, who realized he knew the one thing that would save me. And he must have found a window, opened it, and shouted through it that saving sound that saved me. And he must have felt a failure, I am sure, that other me, because he failed. He did. He didn't save me from those things that beat me. And he must have sat like some sad god from sadder scriptures and wept at all he failed to do. He had so little time. And all my life, I've been climbing up to little windows, opening them and saying the one thing I can say. Thank you. Thank you. I feel that I'm in such debt to whatever it was that said poetry to me. It has held my life steady. I'm in debt to an education system in Ireland too that had poetry as part of the curriculum from the first week we started school till the final week we finished. Every week we were learning off a poem by heart, one in English, one in Irish, or what some people call Gaelic, we tend to call it Irish. And that kind of gave a spine of poetry and literature to a life for all of us. And I am so grateful for an Irish education system that valued poetry as a civic good and as a historical good and as almost a psychological importance, some way to hold yourself together. I know we're going to have a little bit more of a conversation in this. So Rachel and Neil, anytime you want to interrupt me and focus me to ask me a question, I'm very happy to be interrupted. Or anytime anyone wants to put a question to ask me something from the seminar, I'd be thrilled as well. So please feel very free to do that. I'm easily interruptible. I'll probably wait till I finish a poem before I answer it, but I'd be delighted if there was any interaction. Here's a poem called The Facts of Life. It's kind of a list poem. I should say, I think The Facts of Life is a television program, or was a television program in the United States. I didn't know that when I wrote this. The Facts of Life is a term that's used at home and maybe here to talk about sex, where people would say, have your parents told you about the facts of life yet? Was really, have your parents or whoever told you about sex yet? So partly this poem is a play on the idea that the facts of life is such a strange thing to think that sex is the only fact of life when there are so many others. The facts of life. That you were born and you will die. That you will sometimes love enough and sometimes not. That you will lie, if only to yourself. That you will get tired. That you will learn most from the situations you did not choose. That there will be some things that move you more than you can say. That you will live. That you must be loved. That you will avoid questions most urgently in need of your attention. That you began as the fusion of a sperm and an egg of two people who once were strangers and may well still be. That life isn't fair. That life is sometimes good and sometimes even better than good. That life is sometimes not so good. That life is real. And if you can survive it, well, survive it well, with love and art and meaning given where meaning's scarce. That you will learn to live with regret. that you will learn to live with respect, that the structures that contain you may not be permanently containing, that you will probably be okay, that you must accept change before you die, but you'll die anyway, so you might as well live, and you might as well love. You might as well love. You might as well love.
Thank you, Patrick. Thank you. What I can say is students in my class, that's the poem that they always come back to. And you might as well love. You might as well love. And what a generous message to give to people. And it speaks. So do you feel that you have any answers?
No. No, I'm it's not only that I don't have answers, that I'm relatively uninterested in the kinds of things, in the kind of literary formulation of an answer. An answer can often be an explanation, and I'm not sure that explanation will help. I'm not sure that understanding is what will lead to living a life. I suppose I'm interested in practice rather than explanation. And that for me is a theological commitment. I grew up very conservative Catholic and found great love and devotion within the practice of religion. But I suppose over the course of many years and many different things that happened, I found myself intellectually as well as personally uninterested in systems that try to explain, and much more interested in systems that try to say, here's something interesting that happened. Here is a way to be open to people. Here's a way of having conversations that doesn't assume anything about other people, but rather has curiosity and courage, and can engage in argument as well as engage in questions. And that became much more interesting to me. And certainly the facts of life, kind of one of the subtexts of it is to move away from ideas of seeking explanations and to think much more in terms of practice. I'm a very concrete person. I'm not very good at abstracts. Maybe that's my
I know that. I hate to interrupt, but I know that, and we're trying to make this organic. When we visited you in Belfast and we went to the 9x10,
you said,
what's that?
10x9, yeah.
10x9. I always get that mixed up. But you said, get to the story.
Mm-hmm.
Get to the story.
Yeah.
And, you know, what I feel about that poem is you're speaking truth, and you're not expanding it to the point where you're trying to complicate it, right? You're trying to clarify it. And I know that works particularly with my students. So thank you for that.
Yeah, sure. I'm curious if any of the students in the class have something they want to say about the poem, a line you'd add to it or a line you take away. I'm curious.
Let me jump in real quick, and this might help some of the students with that. Some of them are my students, so I know that this is very interesting to them, and I think this will speak to them. But this poem, Facts of Life, seems like it's a pretty common conversation we have with ourselves every day. And when, so much of it resonates, like when, even if the only lie you tell is to yourself. I mean, I can't tell you how many times a day I am like, no, I didn't eat that much today. I can have, even those tiny little things. And then the harder truths too, that we suppress. And I'm just wondering, you wrote it down and you speak it aloud, but that had to have taken time, right? I mean, you had to have had several experiences to shape it into something that, oh, well, this is normal and this is what we do. And I shouldn't be afraid of it anymore. And I just wonder if you could say a little bit about that and then talk about the day that you decided you were going to say it aloud, that you were going to accept these things as part of being alive and want to share it with other people so that you could bring that comfort to them as well.
This is an unusual poem for me because it arrived all at once. I mean, it has had little changes, but very few really since the first time I wrote it down. But I think all of the work came way before writing it down. And looking at, so like I trained in conflict resolution, and when you've got people who come together in a situation of conflict, usually they disagree about facts. You said this, you said this. When you said this is what you meant. When you said this, or when you did this is what you meant. And those are often put across in a conflict as a fact. This is the only interpretation of that event. And usually that's one of the places where conflict exists, because somebody else might say, well, A, that's not what I said, true or not true. And B, that's not what I meant. And that's complicated as well, because sometimes who cares what you meant? Here's what you said, or here's what you did. And so this word facts is really important when it comes to anybody working in conflict resolution, is to realize that one of the deep difficulties in any argument is to help people agree on what they're arguing about, because usually people are having different arguments at the same time in a room. So the word fact for me, for many years previous to writing this book, was a word that I spent a lot of time thinking about and a lot of time working in groups with. Groups of people who'd been bereaved through violence in the north of Ireland, groups of people who were affected by homophobia, groups of clergy who wanted to justify their own cautious approaches to LGBTQ people. And so facts is a really important and weighty word for me, and not something to be taken straightforwardly, because there are so many different versions about what the fact is, about what's happening in any given moment. I do believe in truth. I'm not misty about that, but there are so many overlapping facts, and which one comes first and which is the most important. All of these things are vital. And I think for having been involved in conflict resolution for so long, that also changed my approach to religion when it came to thinking about facts, because in religious gatherings, people would often say, the fact is that God loves us, or the fact is that anybody who isn't a member of this religion is going to hell, or the fact is that the fact is. And I suppose I just stopped believing that. And I was much more interested in thinking, well, what are you saying? What are you getting to? What can we say is a fact in life? And in response to facts, what do we do rather than what do we believe, or who do we recruit into what structure? And so it was strange for me, in a certain sense, that this poem was the culmination maybe of 10 years of deconstruction, but it arrived all at once. And part of it too was an intergenerational thing, that you began as the fusion of a sperm and an egg of two people who once were strangers and may well still be. That isn't about saying, oh God, my parents are divorced, or they had an unhappy marriage. It is a way of saying, aren't we all strangers to each other? Aren't the people who love each other most still strange to each other? And don't we find, as life unfolds, all kinds of strange things in the lives of people who we have shared life with for years or decades? And that for me is an invitation into the strangeness of experience, and that is a fact, rather than thinking, I own you, I know you, and I know what you'll do, and you are known to me. I suppose in this there is an intergenerational curiosity too, rather than a judgment of older people or of younger people. I'm curious and thinking, how can we turn to each other in curiosity?
Thank you.
Thank you. And be receptive enough of other people's points of view.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I don't know. How does poetry and your work like broaden the scope? I mean, I'm not asking you to give yourself a compliment or anything like that, but I think, how is telling stories, like, how does that bring people together?
So there's a few levels of this, and we're going to do a writing exercise, I believe, later on in our time together talking about this. So these days, here's a silly story. I hope I haven't said it in an environment you've been in before. Where's my watch? Here's my watch. I bought this watch a few years ago. I'm living in New York at the moment, and I actually bought it in New York when I was on a trip. It's a Swatch watch, and I was buying it in the shop, and the fella in the shop said to me, "Hey, do you want to come to a Swatch party on Thursday night?" And I was like, "What? No, my God, why would I want to go to?" But I also said, like, what happens at a Swatch party? And he said, everybody gets together and shares their Swatch story. And I thought, bloody hell, how that sounds hellish and utterly boring. But I wondered how much the consultant who'd come up with that idea was being paid, the marketing consultant. And I wondered at the promise of story in that, the idea that this watch somehow gives me a story to tell. And I'm frustrated at the idea that marketing knows this so well, that we have stories to tell, and marketing wants to say, hey, your Swatch story will give you a sense of belonging, and that's important with other people. I don't think your Swatch story will give you a sense of belonging. I don't think, but so much of marketing and capitalism works on that idea, not just that this will be useful to you, but this will become you. You'll become a Mac user. You'll become somebody who cycles this kind of bicycle. You'll become somebody with this kind of car. It isn't just that, oh, I'll be able to get there quicker, or I'll be able to tell the time accurately, or whatever. It is, I will become something. And that is a false economy of imagining that you'll ever be your story. Your story is always changing. And for me, what I'm curious about is, rather than saying, here is my story, as if I could tell it, I'm much more interested in people saying, here's what happened to me yesterday. And here's what happened to me the day before. And here's something I've been thinking about for years because it happened to me when I was 12. Or here's something that I did when I was 15. And just telling the story as a narrative unit, rather than thinking, this is me. Because there are so many yous. We are plural, we are multitudes, and that can be devastating as well as delightful, and everything in between. And so the idea that you are ever just one story of yourself or one version of yourself is a limited imagination. You're a different version of yourself with siblings than you are with other friends, or with a teacher, or with somebody in authority, or when you're in authority, or when you're frightened, or when you're courageous, or etc., etc. All of these things bring out different versions of us. And the point isn't, I don't think, to synthesize them all and just come up with the one true version. It is to say that they're all true. And the question is what does it mean to observe that? And so therefore, I'm really interested in situations where people are speaking less about here is the summation of me, and rather saying, here's what happened and here's how I acted. That's so interesting, because it's not saying it's the same always and everywhere. It is really saying, here's an experience I had, and people are going to wonder, what happened next? What happened next? What happened next? And that, I think, is a really engaging and interesting and curious way to live. I see Gillian has a question here. Will I read it out, or do we want to get Gillian to read it out, or how do we do this, Rachel and Neil?
Yeah,
I can read it if you'd like.
Yeah.
Or
can Gillian say it? Maybe Gillian doesn't want to. But
Gillian can if she would like to. The thing is, I'm not sure if she can raise her hand if she would like to read it aloud.
Yeah. Or I think we can click answer live. Does that work?
Well, let's try.
Oh no, I think that's you going to answer live. No.
Well, if she could raise her hand and then we could allow her to talk if she would like to. Gillian, if you would like to ask your question aloud. Okay, she raised her hand, so I'm going to allow her to talk. Okay.
Hi, Gillian.
Hello.
Hi, I can hear you.
Hi. Okay. Let's see. Let's pull my question over because I don't remember it.
Or you can just say, you don't have to read it exactly. You can just say it, the question's living in you. Yeah.
So this concept of being more fulfilled in faith and theology that's rooted in this sort of picking apart and feeling of it rather than this gathering of facts that you were talking about. That's something that's really resonating with me, and is something that I've been like thinking about for a little while now. Is there any advice that you have for somebody who's trying to look and connect with that actually having of faith and feeling of it, rather than after like only being taught how to follow these facts and like guidelines for so long?
Yeah. Do you want to say anything more about your question, Gillian? Because it's such an interesting question. I'm sure there's an entire, there's many years of thinking behind your question.
Yeah. So I'm in one of Neil Dwyer's classes, and we were watching a video of you speaking recently, and you talked about this baptism you were involved in.
Oh yeah.
And that you were asked to read a poem for, and you said there was this like commingling of paganism and Christianity that really struck you, and that's something that I find super interesting. So if you would also be willing to expand upon that a little bit, that would be really cool.
Yeah, that was a beautiful baptism. I'm not really from a tradition that does adult baptisms, so it took me by surprise that I was reading poetry at this event, and I said, "Would you want to be involved?" The next morning before I drove back to Belfast, in this baptism, somebody wanted to get baptized, and the woman who was leading the retreat was ordained as an interfaith minister, and so she's grew up Irish Catholic, and so there's a lot of Catholicism in her practice, but she also knows that so much of early Christianities in Ireland took enormously from the way of spirituality that was existent in Ireland for millennia before that, or evolving for millennia before that, which has such a respect for water. So everybody stood in water. There was tiny little fish nibbling at my feet as I read this poem. It was extraordinary. And I suppose one of the things that I'd like to say to you, Gillian, when it comes to thinking about a faith, that, I mean, I don't know that, facts and deconstruction are necessarily the opposite. I certainly believe in facts, but I deeply believe in questions too, and continuing to ask. And I am utterly uninterested in recruitment. And I think recruitment is usually the death of curiosity, because recruitment is trying to say, join. You need to be part of this religion so that whatever that is, you'll get to heaven, or you'll avoid hell, or you'll be in the truth, or whatever. Recruitment, I think, is the diminishing of curiosity. Now, if somebody wants to join something, of course, that's different, rather than going out and trying to actively recruit people into something. And I suppose I want to say that asking questions about religion is nothing new. You find in every tradition that the tradition has mystics as well as writings that are filled with complicated, plural experiences of following along in that religious tradition. So it isn't something that's been happening of late when it comes to the question about religion and trying to follow along and using your brain as well as your body, as well as your spirit, as well as your heart when it comes to response. The Jewish tradition of Midrash can almost be considered to be a psychoanalysis of the text. And for thousands of years, Jews have had this practice of taking a text and asking questions about it. So, for instance, when Abraham takes his son Isaac to the top of the mountain and almost kills him, and then says, "Oh no, but God provided a ram." One of the Jewish Midrashic texts from the Babylonian era, which is 2,500 years ago, said, what did they talk about when they came down the mountain? What an amazing sense of confidence in self to say, I'm going to ask that question. Another question from Rashi about 1,000 years ago asks, when in the Garden of Eden there was the serpent going to tempt, why did the serpent go to Eve and not Adam? How interesting. And he doesn't answer these questions. Really, part of the practice of it is having the confidence to ask them and knowing that asking the question opens up a spaciousness to realize this text holds so much more than just one idea to say, here's what it means and here's how to follow it. The text is wild and uncontainable and can be read in different circumstances through different lenses and is malleable. And so I suppose when it comes to what you're speaking about here, I suppose what I'd say is ground yourself deeply in a tradition and ask the best questions from life that you know of that tradition. There will be no tradition that's perfect. The whole point is not to find the perfect one, but the whole point is to find, perhaps you've got an interest in kind of early Christianity and its engagements with earth religions. Perhaps the point is to find a way where you can begin to ask rich and fulfilling questions about that. You could read Genesis 1 and 2, for instance, and make a note of all the earth references that take place in those two poems of creation. It clearly was written by poets and writers who were also agriculturalists of necessity, because, subsistence farming was a real thing for most people at that stage. And so there's all kinds of ways within which you can engage with texts and find something in it. And so that's what I think will help. Giving yourself the confidence to say, I love the text too, but I love it because it's strange. I love it because it's a bit wild. I love it because what you're saying the text means is only one of the possibilities for what the text might mean. And that, I think, is deeply fulfilling and intellectually as well as spiritually engaging. I hope that's helpful.
It was, and if it's just okay for me to follow up on that a little bit, I actually, after that class, I went out and I had like dinner with some friends who are like part of this like faith group here at the church, and I talked to them about what resonated for me from what you were talking about with the baptism and the pagan and the Christian. And they responded with that sort of intellectual discussion that you were talking about, and one of them talked about this like prayer of invisibility of Saint Patrick, and how like when you look at that, it very much like is very similar to like some of the druidic sort of spells, and stuff that were at the time. And so they brought up this idea of those like sources of divinity, of like, instead of praying to a river that you would just pray to in the Christian sense, to the God that was in charge of whatever spirit inhabited that river. And how those different kinds of faiths, though they would appear like very separate, could coexist. So do you have anything to say to this idea of like intersectionality between different religions?
I mean, your friends were correct in the sense of when you look at the famous lorica breastplate of St. Patrick, there's a part of it, I am the stag of the seven hills, in the middle of it, that is a really clear engagement with a much older poem, the Song of Amergin. And what's clear is that Patrick was familiar with the poetries and actually respected the poetries that were existent, rather than Patrick coming in as this Christian missionary, banishing paganism from Ireland and ushering in this Christianist era. What's evident is that he had profound respect. Now, he had something he wanted to say too. I'm not saying that he didn't believe in the particularity of Christianity. His life had been changed and nurtured by it, and he had a message he wished to say. But he wished to say his message in a deep and respectful engagement with the question about what was already there. What were the what were the poetries that were existent? And you're right, the Druids had a certain kind of poetry that could be called incantation. They probably stole that from somebody else too. All of these things are echoes of traditions, and so many of them pay attention to what's observable in the natural world. And I think that's so interesting. It's evidence that we have been looking at the natural world and trying to think, what can words say about what I can see, for thousands and thousands of years. And so many of the world's traditions gather around that. So, yeah, I mean, I think you'll find ways, like if you go to a Catholic Mass, you'll hear at one point, "Blessed are you, Lord God of the universe, who has given us the fruit of the vine, fruit of labor and work of human hands, it would become for us our spiritual bread." That's almost completely taken from a blessing for bread in a Jewish service, Baruch Adonai. And so there's ways within which, sometimes with great ease and sometimes with a certain sense of appropriation over the millennia, all of these traditions have influenced each other and moved back and forth with each other. And I think that's so interesting. There's so much common ground as well as strange ground. And I like both. I notice, Rachel, that you have been joined by somebody who has things to say and things to eat.
Yes, she's very excited to be here to meet you, Padraig. This is Maya.
How lovely to meet Maya. Is Maya eating a rusk?
Maya is eating a little Cheeto.
Oh, a Cheeto. Okay. Soon to be followed by whatever else is on the table, or indeed perhaps eating the table.
She does like food quite a bit.
Yeah.
I'm going to go ahead and Julian, thank you so much for your question too. That was really a wonderful conversation. And again, I think, just like the poem suggested, these things that we think about and try to make sense of, just like what she said. So I'm going to just so that we can have someone else join and just encourage. Hopefully we can hear another poem here now from Padraig, and then just to encourage the other students here with us and everyone else to ask questions so that we can carry on this wonderful conversation.
Yeah. I've actually got two Genesis or Garden of Eden poems that I'd like to share. And that'll move us on to thinking about stories that are told about the origin of ourselves. And then we can think a little bit about stories that we tell about the origin of ourselves as well. So here's one. I think, I don't know the kind of literary interests of people in the room. Broadly, from the book of Genesis that is in the Hebrew Bible, there's an opening poem about the God create over the course of 7 days, over the course of 6 days, creating a certain order of things, and then on the seventh day resting. That's the first poem of creation that you find in Hebrew Bible, Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2 is a different poem that uses a different name for God and imagines this place between four rivers, this extraordinary garden. And then the God character makes this earth person, Adam is the word for the earth person, and places Adam in the garden. And then is trying to find a companion. And when the companion can't be found, the God character splits the earth person apart into man and woman. And so Adam wasn't the first man, Adam was the first earth person. And therefore the splitting apart really becomes this idea that of an original unity. You might like that or not, but certainly it's much more subtle than the very reductive imaginations to say, first of all, God created a man, and after that then a woman was made, and being waved at by Maya, which is absolutely lovely. So anyway, there's two poems here playing around with these ideas. This poem is called The First Fight. Afterwards, Adam wandered round naming things. Mountain, he said, covered in sweat from a day's hike. Then earthquake, watching forests fall between the earth's shifting plates. And breeze, cooling down. God arrived, unnoticed. Avoidance, God said, and Adam turned around. Who invited you? Eve sent me, God replied. She's naming all the things that are underneath the earth. things that will cause the rising and the falling of many other things. Adam sat down and began to cry. Tears, he said, and rage and frustration at all I feel and cannot say, and shut up, God interrupted. Adam turned around. God had gone away. Here's another Genesis poem called Make Believe. Make believe. And on the first day, God made something up. Then everything came along. Seconds, sex, and beasts, and breaths, and rabies, hunger, healing, lust and lust's rejections, swarming things that swarm inside the dirt, girth and grind and grit and shit and all shit's functions, rings inside the tree trunk and branches broken by the snow, pigs' hearts and stars, mystery, suspense, and stingrays, insects, blood, and interests, and death. Eventually, us, with all our viruses, laments, and curiosities, all our songs and made-up stories, and our songs about the stories we've forgotten, and all that we've forgotten. And to hold it all together, God made time, and those rhyming seasons that display decay. For me, part of the curiosity in thinking about any creation story, and you find these extraordinary creation stories in so many religions, different places have different imaginations. The understanding and the recognition is that 5,000 years ago, when lots of them began to emerge, these creation stories, people were not unintelligent. People were not unsophisticated. People had a serious and literary engagement. They weren't trying to say, oh, this is science. They were looking for a story that holds them together. And that is a narrative turn that every human community has, to find a story, a piece of art that holds you together, that it explains the past in a way that might give you an imagination about what it means to be active and present in the here and now. And that, I think, is a really interesting engagement with these stories. I don't think they were ever meant to be taken literally. They're meant to be taken literarily, which is much more difficult to think, what does the story tell us about the condition of being human? And therefore, it's much more interesting. When I hear scientists categorize groupings of people to say, oh, you all believe the world was created in 6 days. I know very few people, I wouldn't necessarily call myself religious, but I know very few religious people who do think that the world was created in 6 days. What they do think is that there is a poem that was describing something about the human condition that has profound truth and interest in the here and now. And I want to engage in that literature with great respect and great curiosity, as well as courage to say, I'm going to go into it. One of the things in that make-believe poem is, on the first day, God made something up. In that context, I suppose I'm curious about the imagination. If you want to take the idea that the world is a response to the imagination of a God, well, then what does that say to us about how we understand our own imagination? And what is the essential function of the imagination? And if something isn't happening or doesn't exist now, what would it be like to understand that you could make something up and perhaps then be part of the ongoing creation, perhaps writing your own book of Genesis or participating in that, for instance. I'd love to hear from other people if you've got questions or responses about these ideas of these little Genesis poems. Are you going to say something, Neil, or are there questions?
I was going to say I had a very similar experience, not to the extent that you did, but growing up Catholic, I was an altar boy and went through all that. But I remember looking at the Stations of the Cross, right around and they had little clay figures, and my imagination led me to think that they come alive at night, right? And they jump off the little ledge. But that made me do what you just suggested, is like start asking questions. And you've talked before about the difference between fact and fiction, but why isn't fiction as valid as fact, right? I mean,
Yeah, for sure.
because if you believe in the story, and you're right, I'm sorry to interrupt, but the idea that poets wrote the Old Testament and the New Testament, I mean, and people believed it, and they continue to ask questions about it. I mean, I don't mean to go on and on about this, but I know it was the same process that I had. Like, what really are we after here?
Yeah.
And go ahead.
Well, to my mind, part of the curiosity about any belonging community is ways within which people, as part of that belonging community, can engage creatively with the stories from that belonging community. So, for instance, you, as a Catholic child, looking at the Stations of the Cross and imagining that they would all hop down from the wall and engage with each other in the evening time. I mean, I used to be a school chaplain. Had any young person said that to me, I'd be like, what do you think they say? And who do you think hangs out with who? And what about people who are enemies? Jesus and the Roman soldiers, for instance. Would they have spoken to each other? And who would have said what? And in the morning, do you think that any of them would like to go back to a different place or do something differently in the context of that? If they could change the story, what do you think they'd do? And what would happen then? And what would be a new Station of the Cross if you were to take all those characters? That, to my mind, is the work of religion, because it is to help us to pay attention to the here and now and to engage creatively in a way where you can say, here is what my moral imagination would say. There's this famous story from the Gospel of Luke called The Prodigal Son. It's kind of entered into the lectionary these days, or the linguistics of the everyday. People will often talk about somebody coming back and saying, oh, look, you're like a prodigal daughter or a prodigal son. And it's a story of a man who had two sons, and the younger son said, give me my inheritance because I want to spend it, which is basically saying, give me what you're going to give me when you die because I want to spend it now. So he goes off and he spends the money, and then he comes back. Having been, impoverished, and the father runs out and greets him and then holds a party. And then they're saying, well, where's the older brother? And the older brother's out, working in the fields. And so the father sends a servant out to get the older brother, and the brother won't come in, the older brother. And he's saying, look, the young fellow went off and spent his inheritance treating you like you're dead. I've stayed here working my ass off, and you've never given me anything to even have a small party with my friends. So one time at Corrymeela, this Peace and Reconciliation Centre I used to lead, we read this as part of a service and said to people, if you could change one thing, what would you change? And there was this young fella there, 15. I think he might have had to come to this event on a Friday evening because his friends dared him to go to the boring religious event. He wasn't religious at all. And he said, I've never heard this story before. And he said, what's really annoying to me is that they're not talking to each other. How amazing, The younger brother comes back, the father throws a party and doesn't go out to find the younger brother himself or the older brother himself. They're not in communication with each other. And so you can understand why this trinity of men have fractured away from each other, because perhaps that was their fundamental problem, that they weren't communicating to each other. And often that story is told like God's like the older character, and all of us sinful people are either like the resentful older brother or like the squandering younger brother. And the point of us all is to come back to God. But actually this 15-year-old was saying, nobody's communicating to each other at all except the younger brother. So maybe he's the courageous one, and maybe God is too silent, and maybe people who claim to be close to God are just full of resentment. I just thought that was an amazing engagement with the piece, and it allowed it to expand in a magnificent way And that has always been part of the job of the receiving community of any religious tradition, is to find a way with the imagination to realize all of the potential meanings that a story can mean, rather than saying, here's the proper meaning, here's where Jesus is, here's where God is, here's the proper way, do that or you're off to hell. I mean, that is the defeat of the imagination and the defeat of the intellect. What's much more interesting is this 15-year-old who said what he said. He had heard the story so carefully that he had a critique of it. I thought he was brilliant.
Rachel?
I can backtrack just a little bit to a couple of things that you kind of led into, Neil, about signs of life and paying attention to signs of life. And that poem that you read, I first heard it in a conversation you had with Naomi Shaib-Nye, I guess about a month ago. And it was amazing to have you both on the screen together. But also, it was for a program called Then, Now, Now, Then, or maybe I have that backwards, but I found that fascinating too. And when you read that poem, you said some similar things that I found very intriguing. But the one question that kept coming up for me was, okay, but how do we learn to pay attention to signs of life in the here and now? And then thinking about what Neil was saying about, the Stations of the Cross coming alive, and your response to how you would have responded to that question, I don't feel is a common response to, those questions. And typically it's what you were talking about earlier, like, well, there's fact, and then there's imagination. And I think my experience with religion anyway has always been fact. This is how it is, and this is the ritual, and it's the same all the time, and it never changes. And I find that might impede this ability to live that aware of life happening and changing when you're basically told that the cycle is going to remain the same, even if you have this imaginative, just the second of imagining things coming down off the walls, or, like Maya has right now, just aware and just in love with everything that goes away after a while, sadly.
Yeah. Well, I mean, what's evidence though is that the texts themselves demonstrate the imagination of someone. Like a biblical text demonstrates the imagination. Somebody made up a metaphor. They called God a thundering fire. They called God a cauldron that would burn us up. They called God, like Jeremiah did, a deceiving stream. These are evidences of the fact that there were people who sat and thought, what do I want to say to God? What metaphor do I want to say? What language do I want to say? So the texts themselves are much braver than the people who speak about the texts in contemporary circumstances. To say, believe, 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 believe. That's a complete failure. I'm much more interested in saying, what metaphor would you use? And if you, like Jeremiah, were in devastation and wished to communicate your devastation to God, what metaphor would you use? Would you use a deceiving stream? Jeremiah said, you are to me a deceiving stream, and I cursed the day when I was born. That's there in the Bible. That's the kind of courage and language that is there. I think there's plenty of agnostics who wrote what we know to consider the Bible. The writer of the book of Ecclesiastes said, look, if you do good, you still might die poor and sad. Do good anyway. Wherever that field of writers is, I'm in the corner with the women and the men who wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. That's where I am. They were complete pragmatists. They weren't interested in promises of an afterlife. They were saying, we don't know, but we still think it's good to do good anyway, rather than to profit off the other poor bastards. And that is, to my mind, a way of being enlivened and living in the concrete reality of things, as well as thinking, what do you want to say? Jesus of Nazareth made up all kinds of stories, including that Prodigal Son one, which are almost timeless, and they use archetypes in a way that is so filled with imagination. And so I'm bored really by a lot of religious talk that just says believe, 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 because it makes me think, well, actually, I don't think you believe it if you're so frenetic in your demand for how people should respond. I'm much more interested in people saying it is strange to be alive. And here's a stranger story that will never be fully tamed, that opens us up to the possibility of what it means to live creatively in the here and now. If there's a heaven, well, maybe we'll be happy that we get there. But let's live as if there isn't, in order to find a way to turn towards each other as if this really matters.
So maybe another poem, but I just wanted to comment on what you said at the very end there, to live as if there is not a heaven. And I just think that is something else that, for me, it's just, I don't know. I mean, how do you do that? When there are so many people telling you the goal is to get there, the goal isn't to stay here, but
it's a destination location, right?
right. And so it's really hard. I know in the work that you do, it has to be a challenge to not change someone's mind. I don't know how you would say it. Not maybe just open it up or I don't know. How would you say that? And then maybe you could read us another poem.
Well, I'm never interested in changing other people's minds. If somebody believes in heaven, I'm not going to argue with them, unless they're trying to recruit me, But even then, I'm uninterested in dismantling what gives somebody comfort. Like that is a profound discourtesy to do that, because while they're saying they really believe in heaven, what they actually might also be saying is, I'm full of grief. My friend died last week, and I'm being given comfort by the imagination of another place. And I think, yeah, me too. I'm also full of grief. And I love the idea of what would be possible if we thought that there would be a great reunion in some kind of other place. What a gorgeous imagination. How complicated to administer it. Where would you feed? Where would you shit? How would you talk? How would you meet up people? Would all the people from all the worlds be there? So I'm filled with administrative questions, but I wouldn't ask them, and I certainly wouldn't deconstruct what would give somebody else comfort. If they're being violent with it, though, if, for instance, there's somebody in grief and there's a person in religious authority saying, stop being grieving, they're in a happier place now, so stop mourning, you're evidencing selfishness, I probably would intervene, because that, to my mind, is abuse rather than comfort. And so, after a good friend of mine died last year, I wrote all kinds of poems thinking about all the imaginations of the afterworld. In one of them, I was putting a piece of silver under my own tongue, hoping that the same piece of silver was under my friend's tongue, so that when we crossed the river Styx with Charon, driving that boat across the river Styx into the underworld, that somehow we'd meet each other early. I took such comfort in that mythology. Mythology is not just discountable or not just the imagination. It speaks about some longing, some eternal longing. And we are caught in this strange thing about what does it mean to be alive and what does it mean to realize that we'll die. And we don't have answers to that. So we tell stories. And the point is I think, to respond to each other's stories with curiosity rather than dominance.
Thank you.
Thanks, Padraig. So could you share another poem, and then maybe we can ask for more questions and maybe do a writing prompt.
I'll share a poem and then I'll do a writing prompt.
Okay.
I see. Let me see. So here's a poem called "Let the Waters Swarm with a Swarm of Living Beings." I'm somebody who, when I start to read a poet, I like to read everything they've written. And so I'd always been intrigued by Emily Dickinson, that extraordinary American poet who lived from 1830 to 1886 in Amherst, Massachusetts. She died when she was 56 years old. In fact, almost 56, she was 55. such an amazing person, so full of curiosity, so full of her own language. And so I decided I'd read all of her poems, and she wrote 1,776 of them, or 1,775. So I read them all. It took me 2 years because I'd only read a few a day. It was like taking a small bite. And it took me 2 years. And by the end of it, somebody said to me, God, you must really have a grasp about the work of Emily Dickinson now. And I thought, no, my God, it's like having wandered into a jungle and just hoped to get out alive, hoped to have seen some interesting beasts, and hoped to have experienced fear, and hoped to have had a physical experience. And as a response to that, to think, well, here's some of what I saw, but I can't describe it perfectly. And it certainly isn't tame. So this poem is a response. It really is talking about how strange it was to sometimes think, oh, I've got a grasp of Emily Dickinson's work. And other times just thinking, I'm totally lost and I'm drowning almost, or I'm under attack from the magnificent words that she's using. But in another way, it's also a poem about what it means to live in relationship to any text, whether that's a religious text or the constitution of a country. First time I heard Americans say when they were living in Ireland and having a Thanksgiving meal, oh, you know, we're honoring the fact that America was a nation founded on godly values. Every Irish person in the room was like, are you joking? Would an Indigenous person tell that story? This was 25 years ago. It just seemed bewildering to people from a country like Ireland that has been occupied and that has been under the thumb of colonization, that the idea that European Americans could speak about founding anything on godly values when there's genocide at the start of it all. So to my mind, it's the wildness of things that is so important. And so therefore, the story of a country, the story of the origin of a country needs not to be systematized, needs to be threatening, and needs to be told with a certain amount of brutality of its own being, because there is truth and fact in that. So here's the poem. Let the waters swarm with a swarm of living beings. I've been swimming around here for a while now, and while I've never touched the ocean floor, I've tried. You notice things out here, the way the wind makes waves chop at odd angles, the way the water feels warmer at the top, the way the moon makes music when you're half dead with cold, the ways of frozen bones, the way the morning never feels the same. Once a seal bumped me, came right up to me like a sea puppy, and I swear it smiled. I was floating happy after that. I said, the ocean is my home. Then a storm came, then the waves, then the lightning spiked the surface, thunder clapped. Hungry beasts swam round me. I saw seagulls eyeing me for scraps. So.
That was lovely.
Are you happy for me to give a writing prompt and then maybe people can write them in the Q&A thing?
That would be a wonderful idea.
Great. So here's the writing prompt. It's very simple. You're going to need to write on something, a piece of paper, a phone, something like that. And then I'd like you to type it in. And here's the writing prompt. If right now you were to tell the story of your life, what would the first sentence be? Maya's coming in quick. If right now you were to tell the story of your life, what would the first sentence be? And hear the question or hear the prompt. It's just right now. This is not if you were to publish a book of the story of your life, because that's a kind of an imagination of permanence, that book will always be in existence. This is just right now. You don't have to start at the start. You don't have to say, oh, I was born on this day in this place, here. You might just want to say, yesterday I got on a bus and spoke to a stranger. That's a great beginning to the story of your life. It can be something utterly concrete and utterly recent. You can do it in the first person, the second person, the third person. You can steal a little bit from a fairy story that you like. You can be totally practical and give the date and day. You can start, 200 years ago, if you know that story. I could start off by saying, my great-great-granddad was the only one in his family who survived the Great Hunger. That would be some of the beginning of my story. So you can do whatever you want. Make it short and make it concrete and make it yours, and know that it's not permanent, because in 10 minutes you could write a different opening sentence. But just do one. And then if you could put it in the Q&A, and then we're going to respond to that. But I'll give you 3 minutes to just write one version. You're not committed to this. This isn't the final version of it. This is just the version you're going to tell now. 3 minutes. So they're coming in. So what I'd like to do would be to just pick up on a few things that I notice in some of them. And again, in every one of these, I'm going to comment appreciatively on them. So you don't have to hold your breath thinking, oh God, he's going to say, here's where you should have improved it. That's not my interest. So Gillian Newhouse's, these days I'm sure that the purpose of life can be found in Wendy Cope's poem, The Orange. I know that poem, I know it well, and I love it. But what strikes me is that lots of people who would hear that first sentence mightn't know the poem. And you don't have to know the poem in order to understand Gillian's brilliant sentence. Because first of all, Gillian starts off by saying, these days, which makes me think, well, there was a before. This has been somebody who's come on a kind of an evolution of change and has, what would she have said before these days? So that's just in the first 2 words, I'm struck by that. And these days, I am sure the purpose of life, what a magnificent thing, and then can be found in Wendy Cope's poem, The Orange. Not even knowing the poem if people don't. What it says is that somebody might have turned from thinking about systems to turning towards something in a poem. And in a poem simply called The Orange, which is just looking at something completely ordinary and orange. And so I really like what Gillian has done on that, in the sense of the opening words imply a certain kind of change, that there was a before and now Gillian is in the here and the now, and that the change, I'm curious, like a question you could ask about this is, what used you think? And what's it been like to think now? And what is that poem? And I'm curious what Gillian's second sentence would be. I think it's a lovely poem that speaks about a search for purpose and a way that purpose can be found in the context of a poem. Thank you. Alexis's offering, I didn't know how to live without you until I was forced to do so. And since having no choice, I've been able to find myself again. I'll read it again. I didn't know how to live without you until I was forced to do so. And since having no choice, I have been able to find myself again. It's really interesting repetition of the word I. I didn't know how. I was forced. I have been able. Those 3 repetitions of those conjugations with the I, with the first person. I didn't know how. I was forced. I have been able. And quietly there, and since having no choice. It's so interesting that even in that little clause, since having no choice, Alexis has put in a brilliant piece of artistry, that there is no conjugation of the I. It's just since having no choice. Me, myself, and I is completely taken out of that clause. There's a way within which circumstances meant that there was no agency in having no choice. So much so that there isn't even a pronoun that can make its way into that little 1, 2, 3, 5, those 5 words, and since having no choice. And what does it mean, I think, to ask the question of the I? Who am I is a profound question at the heart of so much literature. I think Gillian's question is about, is there a purpose in life? But Alexis's here is, who am I? And I suppose, who is the you? I didn't know how to live without you. Who is that you? Is it a person? Is it someone who was very important? Is it a literary figure? Is it a religion? Is it a god? We don't know. And one of the glorious things in reading a person's life as a story is that usually when you're reading, the author isn't there to answer your questions. And so we're left in all of the plural possibilities of interpretation behind what you could mean here. Thank you very much. Jeremiah has written, 16 years ago, barely 1 month after my birth, I was adopted. A very plain statement of fact. And in the story of this, there is an entire story of all these plural lives that are there. There's a theory that says that there's only 2 stories in the world. A person goes on a journey, or a stranger comes to town. And Jeremiah's piece here in these, I don't know how many words is there, maybe 10 or 11. Both of those ancient world stories are present. 16 years ago, barely 1 month after my birth, I was adopted. There's so much power in it. There's so much change. There's so much story to, on the one hand, to think about 16 years ago, and then on the other hand, to just think about a month, barely 1 month. I find it very moving to think about an individual who was telling this story at 16 years and 1 month, to find a way to own that, to find a way to tell it, and to find a way to let the plain truth of it and the plural imagination of all the lives that one person holds in himself be put out there so brilliantly. I love the first word too, 16, and you've put it down as numbers, Jeremiah, which I think is a magnificent demonstration because it just arrests you in terms of the counting of that 16. Thank you. Deirdre's written, the fullness of my past begins now to make awful sense as my husband slips out of reach. There is so much within the context of this. Husband slips out of reach. What does that mean? Is it that somebody has died and it's more difficult to remember the sound of their voice? Is it that there's a separation? Is it that this person is living, but perhaps is living with dementia? I have no idea. It could be all of these things from the context of this. And the fullness of my past begins now to make awful sense as my husband slips out of reach. This word awful here is doing so much work. If this piece from Deirdre had just said, the fullness of my past begins now to make sense as my husband slips out of reach, it would have been an entirely different sentence. But the word awful here is so weighty and is so powerful and is so resonant with the way within which an adjective like this can do really, really important work. So there is a before and an after in this, and in the context of Deirdre's sentence, there is a crisis too, and this centered together perhaps in awful sense and slips out of reach, a way within which a person has suddenly realized, oh, now I understand the past. You've come to a denouement, as you'd say in literature. Thank you very much, Deirdre, for writing that. Mary has written, this story does not go how I thought it would go. How fantastic. This story does not go how I thought it would go. From the very beginning, the story is undoing itself. And what we're hearing is that there is a conflict within the person, that they thought it would go one way and it didn't, and instead it's gone another. Is this a creative conflict? Is it that they thought it would be terrible and actually it's been great? Or is it the other way around? Or is it something else entirely? We don't know yet. But what we're hearing is that this person has had to come to a point of change. And change and conflict have a lot to say to each other. Conflict doesn't just mean dominance and annihilation and war. Conflict here means something potentially creative. Somebody has written, the day I began to realize my worth and started to accept nothing but the best for myself because that's what I deserve. Again, a realization of coming to a certain point of reckoning and beginning to see in a new way, which changes your experience. Wayne has written, I looked across the kitchen table into the question in the eyes of my enemy. My God, what is the question in the eyes of my enemy? What question is that? Why are they at a kitchen table? And why are Wayne and the enemy, or whoever the I is here, why are they in that situation? And what would it take to perceive the question in the eyes of my enemy? What's so interesting is that it's not in the mouth or in the words or in the actions of my enemy. It's in the eyes of my enemy. The word eyes here, of course, links back to the word looked. I looked across the kitchen table. The kitchen table does such interesting work. Is it your own kitchen table? Is it the kitchen table of an enemy? Is it a random kitchen table? We don't know. We haven't found out yet. But in the possibility of this small sentence, so much of a world story is there. And finally, Tamika, I finally accepted who I am, and that's all right with me. Again, we hear an echo that you can hear in some of the other people's work too. The finally. If it had just said, I have accepted who I am, and that's all right with me, that too would have been a lovely sentence. But it's made much more powerful by this word here. I have finally accepted who I am. What has been the process of learning to do that acceptance? What's it been like to come to that realization? And that's all right with me. The word all right here is doing a lot of interesting work. You know, it doesn't say I finally accepted who I am and that's amazing with me. It just says that's all right with me. This is a person who has begun to reckon with their own standards for themselves rather than other people's standards. And this is a way within which Tamika's own story is an echo of a wider world story and a wider way within which people can be manipulated into not accepting who they are, and all the ways within which that's not all right with them, and all of the distress that can come with it. Tamika's story in this single sentence has a lot of powerful resolution to it. So one of the things that interests me in all of this, thank you very much everybody for writing these in. One of the things that interests me is the ways within which a single sentence can contain so much information. And each one of you, if you wished, could say, let me turn a single sentence into 35 sentences and see what happens if you were to tell something totally concrete about that. Not to say this is the story of my life, but it's just right now how I'm going to tell the story of my life, knowing that tomorrow there'll be another, or in 20 minutes there'll be another. Each one of you has offered something so powerful. And in these pieces that you wrote, with only 3 minutes of time given from me to you, you have echoed so many of the concerns and the interests that are part of so many of the world's stories. It's not full, it's not trying to be, but you have touched into powerful themes that are at the heart of so much literature, that are at the heart of so much storytelling, that are at the heart of so much films, at the heart of so much literature. So it's wonderful that you've done that and shown really the creativity that you have and the way within which, when you just say, look, right now, I'm going to do this. Each one of you has extraordinary stories to tell, stories of coming to terms with yourself, stories of realizing I have something that is of interest to me. Sometimes those stories will be dramatic. Something big happened and you've been reckoning with it. Sometimes they won't. I suddenly realized while I was going along on the bus the other day that I love this journey on the bus. How beautiful. That's a lovely thing to say. And to think, tell us all more about the bus. What could you see? Who was on it? How often have you taken the bus? What's another time that you remember being on the bus? Who drives the bus? Do you always sit in the same place? Do you go to different places? Why? All of those things are present in a simple story about being on a bus and having a thought while you're sitting on the bus. So thank you very much for sharing those. I'm so moved. I do see that there was another question that came in from Raylan, which I can come to that in a while, but I want to make sure to go to Neil and Rachel first to think, are there other things that you want to mention? I know that we'll be finishing soon.
I wanted to, so the prompt was wonderful, and I've done that before with my own writing, forcing, and I've had a very dear friend encourage me to continue to do that as well. But there's another side of that, which is the listening side. And so it makes me think, this is great. This is beautiful. And even though it's 3 minutes, that we are listening and we are paying attention, slight distractions, but we're listening. But that's not always the case, right? This is an occasion to come together, to listen to one another. But can you talk a little bit about that? Because I know that I've heard that from you before about the importance of listening, as well as the importance of storytelling. So how do you let a person know that you are willing to listen to the rest of their story?
Well, I think you just ask questions. Somebody might come along and say, oh, I've had the worst day. And then I'm so glad to be here. Rather than going, oh my God, me too, I've had a terrible day too. Just go, what happened? to ask a question. And usually like a question in 2 or 3 words rather than, anything too long. And, if they don't want to tell you, they'll just say, oh, it's too much. That's grand too. You're not going to force people to tell their story. But to find ways within which you can open up the possibility of somebody saying a little bit more. And when people train to be a counselor or a therapist, one of the things that they're sometimes taught, depending as to what school of therapy they're in, is to say 3 very simple words. Tell me more. There's more to say, so tell me more. So if somebody says, I've got the strangest auntie and she's come to visit recently, you're like, tell me more. Tell me about this strange auntie. How interesting. Or if somebody says, I went to see a fantastic film last night, even though I was tired. Like, what was the film? And why did you go? And listen to, it's not just about the film, but it's also about, I was tired, but you went anyway. So to go, why did you decide to go? What moved you to go? To find a way to listen and to say, in very simple ways, not kind of saying, tell me your deepest, darkest secret or analyze for me all of this stuff. We're not each other's psychoanalysts, but just to find a way to say, there's more to the story. Tell the next sentence and the next sentence. I feel lucky in my life to have some friends who have continually evidenced that, where if you say something, they're like, oh, keep going, how lovely. I want to hear more. And that, I hope, has influenced me in the way that I'm interested in people. And certainly, like looking at everything that's so interesting in what you said, so many of us are always starting off the first sentence to our story. You're introducing yourself in a class, or you're introducing yourself to someone. Look at all the richness that's here. Look at the world literature that's being evoked from these utterly ordinary beginning points that all of you have done. Ways within which none of you are alone by saying that, because so much of what you've said has reached out across the few words you've written in order to create a kind of community of understanding and a community of curiosity around the brilliance of your words. How lovely. I suppose at the heart of listening is to think that people are interesting. And that I hope is something that we can nurture. And if they're not, maybe A, think that they probably are, and B, get some new friends.
I had an idea about creating a class called Listening 101 at the college, because I think that's one thing that you've shared with us and given as a gift to us, even as you read through and reflected upon those one-line responses to the prompt. It is that you're listening. You're listening. You're paying attention. And, sometimes, I can't go down on this because you've given us life today, right? Through this session that we've had. And we need more of it because not just because of the pandemic, but because, generally speaking, I've seen, people don't listen to each other. And so if that's one gift among many that you've given us, then, thank you. We need to listen to each other, right? We need to listen to each other. And when you said, tell me more, yeah, I was going to ask you, how did you learn how to listen so well? But I think you kind of answered the question. But Padraig, I want to thank you. Maya wants to thank you. See?
How lovely. Thanks, Maya.
Timing. It's timing.
Beautiful. And now she's acting all bashful.
Well, we got the wave in.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So listen, we'll let you go now. But Padraig, I really do. I know, you're busy with your residency, and I'm just so thankful that you shared this time with us.
Oh, it's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure. I mean, if I would be able to say really briefly to Raylan Sparks Casey, whose question was about, a conundrum about how to have integrity while being in the house of a faith tradition, while also having your own imagination. There are all kinds of ways to belong. For instance, I don't go to Mass. I won't go to Mass in a structure that is fundamentally opposed to recognizing the priesthood of women. I just can't do it. But I go in and do the Stations of the Cross. Of course, I'd go to a funeral or a wedding or a baptism, of somebody I love, and I have many priests who are friends, and I would say to them, here's why, in the midst of loving the sacrament, here's why I feel like I am lying if I participate in something. So that for me is a measure of my own integrity. That's not the only shape. I know other people who have continued to go to Mass daily, despite the fact that they know as women that they have a call to the priesthood and that is a deep vocation in them. And their response is to say, I'm going to be present in the midst of it. There's no one shape to how it should be. So the question for me is, what shape is working for you for now when it comes to that? The fact that you're asking the question, Raylan, makes me think you have an interest and a respect for something. Stick with that, and then find a way to respond to that, and find a way also to let your own integrity speak for now in that shape. The shape of your response won't always have to be the same. It might just be the shape of the response for now. It might be that in a year's time I'm saying, I found a way to be able to go back to Mass because I've been able to make some recognition about how I understand the role of priesthood and women. Or it might be that the Vatican, God help us, would begin to say that they are doing something to make some movement towards that. And I certainly would find that a structural response that I would think, okay, I might find it easier to go back. Certainly, I have found a deep interest in the stories of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels. And so that is one of the things that grounds me, the stories of the Gospels and the Stations of the Cross. Those are the two things that hold me together. And while I'm definitely not a traditional Catholic, I nonetheless find myself in a kind of an agnostic conversation with the home of Catholicism, and knowing I don't want anybody else to kick me out, because I know I am far from singular. There are millions and millions and millions of us in this one tradition alone who would say, yeah, but Pope John Paul used to call that cafeteria Catholicism, as if that was a kind of a derogatory approach. I love cafeterias.
I think there's one more question that just came in. If you have just one more second, you can see it there.
Yeah, I see it. From my poem, How to Be Alone, in that poem I state, there is a you telling you another story of you. Listen to her. What do you mean by that exactly? Am I saying that we need to listen to our gut or heart, or do you mean our conscience? Yes. I just think that there's always going to be another story under the story. In the manufacturing lines of Toyota in Japan, there was an understanding that if a mistake happens on a manufacturing line of a piece of machinery or a vehicle, if a mistake happens, that actually that mistake is probably related to something that's happening elsewhere. It's not just a matter of going, that person's a terrible employee, let's fire them or replace them. So they have this practice of saying, something happened here at this assembly line. Why? And they ask why 5 times. Why did it happen? Because the person was stressed. Why were they stressed? Because they're being put under too much work. Why are they being put under too much work? Because of this. Why? Because of that. And to ask why 5 times suddenly realizes, actually, if we just fired that person, we totally miss the point that there is deep information about something much bigger that's happening that manifested itself in that one instance of that mistake happening over there in the corner. It's a way of understanding a system that's working, that's trying to work together, and that a mistake in the system is actually an indication of information rather than an indication you need to fire that agent. And so I think within the context of the stories that we tell too, I'm so interested in understanding what's the why beneath that? What's the why beneath that? Why did the guy in the Swatch watch invite me to a story? Because I think he probably knew that he'd probably been told to do that. And so if he hadn't invited me to this Swatch watch party, would he have faced being fired? Why? Why? And suddenly even that story that's about capitalist manipulation into a really reductive imagination about what a human community of belonging looks like, even that can be open to the possibility of another story, and to listen to that, to listen to her. That's why I do it, because I think there's so many layers. And as the person had asked, sometimes it's the gut or the heart. Sometimes it's the conscience. Sometimes it's the imagination. Sometimes it's rage. Sometimes it's anger. Sometimes it's something else. Those are the things that I'm curious about, and to listen to them. Thanks very much for the invitation, Rachel and Neil and Maya and everybody who's here. And thank you to everybody, and to everybody who shared their story, and everybody who kept it to themselves. Thank you very much for participating and being here. I'm really glad to have been in this Zoom room with you.
Yeah.
Thank
Thank
you,
you, Padraig.
Wonderful being with you. Good talking to you, seeing you. See you next time.
Hope to see you in person sometime soon.
For sure.
How long are you in New York?
Until May. I leave
Until
at the very early May. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
So,
Well, listen, thanks. Thank you.
pleasure.
Thanks.
My pleasure.
Okay.
All the best.